With inflation and interest rates remaining high, there is widespread speculation of a global recession hitting sometime this year. Well, to give us some insight about what we can expect, we're joined by Chief Economist and Global Head of Economic Research, Bruce Kasman. Bruce, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me here.
So, we're about halfway into 2023. Give us a state of play of the global economy, if you could.
Well, I would use three buzzwords: resilience, divergence, and persistence. Resilience is the idea that the global economy is still doing reasonably well, even in the face of what has been a substantial drag from money and credit tightening. Divergence is the idea that much of the strength we're having this year is in the services industry. Manufacturing is still weak, and much of the strength in terms of regional performance we think is coming from China and from an improvement in Western Europe, who's recovering from a fairly significant shock having come from the Russian invasion of Ukraine last year. In persistence, what I'm talking about is inflation. Yes, we're getting a decline in inflation as energy and food price inflation is coming off, but other components of inflation, what we call core inflation, is staying far too high to be comfortable for central banks.
So, if we do get a recession this year, how severe do you think it will be?
Well, first, right now, we don't think we're on the cusp of a recession. We do think there are forces that are combining that will eventually create a recession. Our baseline is that the U.S. falls into recession at the end of this year and the rest of the world avoids that fate. But I think the important point right now is we're not on the cusp of falling into a recession. The process that will generate that recession is probably going to take place somewhat gradually. And as I said, we think the window opens towards the latter part of this year for the U.S., but it's still quite uncertain as to whether that dynamic will take place late this year or sometime in 24. In addition, it's quite, I think, uncertain as to whether it's going to happen with central banks having to do considerably more in terms of fighting the inflation persistence.
Right, and just on that point, how likely do you think it will be that the US Federal Reserve, just looking at the US for a second, will continue to have to raise rates? Or do you think they have sort of called time on it for now?
Well, I'd note that most central banks outside of the Fed and the Western European central banks have already entered a pause phase. We do think it's quite likely that the Fed will stop hiking with taking a pause at its upcoming June meeting. However, what we're less confident in is that those pauses will represent the terminal rate for the cycle. As I noted, inflation is persistently high. It's not likely to come down to comfort zones. So if the U.S. does not begin its slide into recession sometime later this year, then there's a reasonable chance that the Fed, as well as other central banks, are going to have to continue the fight in inflation and that the pause will be short-lived.
Certainly a picture I know you'll be watching very closely. Bruce Kasman, Chief Economist and Global Head of Economic Research, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.